Welcome back to another episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Ann-Margaret, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brent. This year marks the 25th year since the EAA officially first began operations back in 1996. One of the agency's most long-standing departments, Regulatory Affairs, administers several regulatory programs related to groundwater protection and production, including regulating the metering and reporting of groundwater withdrawals, the storage of regulated materials, above ground and underground storage tanks, and the overall general enforcement of the EAA rules.
In his debut feature on the Recharge Zone podcast, EAA Director of Regulatory Affairs, Earl Parker, will provide the context for these monitoring programs and how they operate as a way to manage and protect the Edwards Aquifer as a groundwater resource that serves more than 2 million people. Welcome to the podcast, Earl. Can you begin and tell us a little bit about yourself and your department?
Hi, Ann-Margaret and Brent, and thanks for having me. I began working at the EAA in July 2003, managing our field and inspection programs. I grew up here in San Antonio, attending Cole High School on Fort Sam, and obtained degrees at UTSA in geology and environmental science. As a matter of fact, while attending UTSA in the early 1990s, I worked as a water resource technician for a few years with the Edwards Underground Water District, which was the predecessor agency to the EAA. After working about 10 years in the private sector doing environmental assessments at military installations, I was fortunate enough to find my way back to San Antonio and the Edwards Aquifer, working at the EAA. In my almost 18 years with this agency, I've spent most of my time working with our regulatory programs and with rules compliance. Our main role is to be sure everyone understands and follows our aquifer management and protection programs.
Thanks for that introduction, Earl. Can you provide a little background on how the EAA regulates the Edwards Aquifer and how exactly your department supports these important programs related to regulation?
Sure. The EAA was created by the Edwards Aquifer Authority Act, which was passed in 1993 by the Texas legislature. It actually began operation, as y'all mentioned, in 1996, which is why this is our 25th year. And of course, the Act is the guiding legislation for the EAA. It specified a basic management program for the Edwards Aquifer groundwater withdrawals based on a well metering and permitting system. The Act required the EAA to issue groundwater withdrawal permits to historic users, and all of those regulated well owners were required to have a water meter put on their well and to begin reporting annual use to the EAA. Groundwater withdrawal permits were issued to municipal, industrial, and irrigation users, while the owners of small wells used solely for domestic or livestock purposes were generally exempted from these permitting and metering requirements. The legislation also required registration of all Edwards Aquifer wells and gave the EAA powers to conduct Edwards Aquifer protection measures and developed rules related to water well construction and closure, and later incorporated rules for certain activities being conducted on the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone.
So Earl, you bring up a good point about these rules following the Act. How did these come about?
The EAA rules are formally adopted by our board of directors and are fully enforceable under state law. The EAA rules carry out the intent of the EAA Act and lay out the specific definitions and requirements for our regulated community. The EAA rules fundamentally transform management of the Edwards Aquifer by instituting a metering and permitting system for these non-exempt groundwater withdrawals from the aquifer and instituted water protection programs affecting the areas around the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone.
So with these regulatory programs, how do they support the overall mission of the EAA? I know we were kind of talking a little bit before about how the Regulatory Affairs Department was kind of the catalyst to some of the other departments at the EAA. So can you kind of let us know how these programs that you mentioned support the EAA mission?
Sure. You know, from the EAA Act, and our agency was granted, and I can quote, all of the powers, rights, and privileges necessary to manage, conserve, preserve, and protect the aquifer, and to increase the recharge of and prevent the waste or pollution of water in the aquifer. And of course, the EAA mission is to manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer system. So it was from these general principles were derived our key regulatory programs. And these include groundwater withdrawal management and water quality recharge zone protection. As we talked, one of the earliest priorities of the EAA, and we can first discuss this, was well registration and the way we manage groundwater. So the way EAA manages groundwater is mainly through four major functions. The first is well registration. We need registrations of all the wells that withdraw from the Edwards Aquifer, and that includes those exempt wells. So our current database, we have more than 7,400 confirmed wells. Most of these are exempt wells, and there are more out there. And we have active well registration efforts to identify those and assist those well owners to register.
Can I ask you a quick question? So I know
Sure.
you mentioned there are more wells out there. What does that exactly mean? Does that kind of define the fact that not all wells necessarily are registered, like some may be abandoned or forgotten, or can you kind of explain a little bit more about that?
Sure, and it goes back to what I'm going to talk about a little bit later about communication. The EAA rules did require all wells to be registered. And of course, the large wells, the ones that were going to get permitted, those were easy to find and register, and those people heard about our requirements. Most of the smaller wells that were used for families, they didn't hear about these requirements. And as you mentioned, those wells that are no longer in use, the ones that have basically been abandoned, maybe those well owners didn't even know they were required to register those. So we do have active well registration efforts where we go out in the community and we verify the wells that are registered, and we find others. And then we reach out to those owners to seek to get them to register their wells in addition.
Yeah, I think we have to remember that back then, these advertisements were done through the newspaper. We didn't have social media. We didn't have the internet as much as we do today. So it was real difficult to get the word out to everyone that these programs were starting.
You bet. So once we get all these wells registered, and we're still looking to do that, one of the key issues with this agency is our groundwater withdrawal management. And as we mentioned before, it really is a permitting and metering regime for all of those non-exempt wells, or those used for industrial, municipal, or irrigation purposes. As part of our requirement, as I mentioned earlier, we were required to issue groundwater withdrawal permits to existing users who pumped during the historical period before the act was put in place. So basically, we issued 572,000 acre feet of permits to these municipal, industrial, and irrigation users. And remember, 1 acre foot is about 325,800 gallons, and enough to service a family or three households in a year. And to go with these permits, we also now have registered 1,680 active meters on the wells that measure withdrawals from the aquifer. So it's this metering and permitting system that mainly drives this withdrawal management program. Also, a way that we manage the aquifer during the droughts or these lower water levels are what we call critical period management. So when the region does see the summers, when the aquifer levels are falling, and we hear on TV that we're entering into these different stage restrictions, the EAA implements on its well owners and permitted well owners the need to reduce their authorization to conserve during these periods. And of course, key to this whole thing is annual use reporting. It's required of all well owners with these meters to report their use every year. And of course, the purpose of that is to make sure that all users are pumping within their authorized amounts. And historically, we've averaged about 352,000 acre feet of metered pumping every year.
So Earl, it sounds like these initiatives so far have really only affected well owners. Is that right?
Yes. These programs are pretty much about groundwater withdrawal management. And it is important that the EAA understand the numbers and types of wells actively pumping across our region. This helps our groundwater modeling efforts and could be used to help notify well owners of local issues that might impact their water. Otherwise, this metering and permitting program regulates the amount of water withdrawn from the aquifer each year. Most EAA groundwater permits are fully transferable, which means a permitted amounts that are conserved and not used by that owner can be sold or leased to other permit holders who may need additional rights to meet their pumping needs. Since the EAA issues no new permits, when someone wants to increase the use from their well or wants to drill a new non-exempt well in the region, they must first obtain water rights from an existing permit holder and transfer those to the well.
You know, it seems that our rules so far have affected well owners, but I think it's important to note this part here where you say that the EAA issues no new permits. So in San Antonio, we know we've seen extensive growth over the past couple of decades, and that's expected to continue. But I think it's important to note that that does not mean there'll be additional pumping to the Edwards Aquifer. So that's why we're seeing a diversification of resources. And I think that's one of the main tenets of our rules, is to help protect that withdrawal of the aquifer from even development. Is that right?
That's right. You know, as more people move into this region, the amount of total permitted withdrawals from the aquifer will always remain the same. So that's why it's important for the large regional developers and water supply companies to seek alternatives from the Edwards Aquifer.
So that number that is withdrawn from the aquifer is that 572,000 acre feet number, right? That is the only amount of water that can be withdrawn from the aquifer in a given year.
Well, yeah, 572,000 acre feet are the total amount of all permits issued. And those permits were issued to well owners based on historical use. And, you know, the historical use periods in the 70s and 80s and 90s, back in those times, a lot of these well owners were using more inefficient methods of water withdrawals, and they were issued permits on that amount. But now, because these permits have value, because they can be traded and sold, well owners and groundwater users have been strongly encouraged to find much more effective and efficient techniques to withdraw their water, to give them this surplus water permitting to be sold to new water users. As I mentioned earlier, we average about 352,000 acre feet of metered pumping. So currently, there is more authorization allowed than we have people withdrawing water from the aquifer.
I see what you mean. Okay.
So regionally, as a collective, as a community of well owners, we do not overpump our aquifer based on this permitted authorization. However, as individual well owners, sometimes they might overpump their authorization. And if you want, we can talk about what happens when you overpump your permit a little later.
Yeah, that sounds great, Earl, but do you think you can kind of touch on how the EAA manages groundwater use during falling water levels or diminishing water levels during droughts that we seem to get from time to time? I know in the past few months we've kind of came in and out of stage 1. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Yes, and we could spend a lot of time talking about this, but very generally, we call these times of declining water levels our critical period management, or CPM. And critical period management affects all EAA permit holders authorized to withdraw more than 3 acre feet annually. So it really affects the larger permit holders. During these critical period times, affected permit holders will see their total authorization reduced, and they are required to file monthly meter readings with the EAA. These two things have the effect of encouraging water conservation during these dry times and making well owners more aware of their groundwater withdrawals. We do have our critical period triggers that are based on index wells here in San Antonio and one in Uvalde County. And of course, you might have even seen our great J17 water levels on your weather every night. It's great for community awareness. And of course, we also monitor the spring flows in San Marcos and in Comal Springs and New Braunfels. And all of those things can trigger the various stages of permit reduction.
I know. So critical period management is an important piece of the puzzle for the Edwards Aquifer Authority in managing the amount of water within the Edwards Aquifer. But I guess I know you mentioned earlier that public water supplies have to diversify their water sources so that the Edwards Aquifer kind of maintains its level. And obviously we monitor that. But are there things that people can do, just the everyday average person, when we do declare stage 1 water restrictions, water conservation measures are important just for everyday people and everyday households, right?
Yeah, I think everybody understands the importance of water here in this region. I think San Antonio and the region has done an excellent job educating the public as to how important and critical our Edwards Aquifer is. I think, the year-round watering restrictions, everything from how you use your water in your household, even as far as turning off the water when you brush your teeth. All these little things contribute to water conservation. And it's so important because we know as we're experiencing more of these drought and flood cycles, that management during these downturns is going to become more and more important. And our critical period rules are one of the ways, only one of the ways, it's the regulatory way that we look to try to get people to conserve during those dry times.
So Earl, that was a really nice comprehensive review of our groundwater withdrawal management. And you mentioned a little bit about water quality and aquifer protection. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yes, these rules came along a little bit later, once we got our permitting system down. And these obviously, it doesn't do a lot of good if you have a lot of water, but it has become contaminated or polluted. And as we've talked about, the Edwards Aquifer recharge zone, that band of area where water enters the aquifer is a little bit more environmentally sensitive. So the main rules that we have around this area deal with new water well construction and operation and closure. As we've talked about around here and, with our public, these water wells are a direct conduit into our aquifer, and they bypass all the protective soils and overlying formations that protect our groundwater. So it's important that water wells are constructed properly by licensed water well drillers, and that old wells are properly plugged and abandoned so that they no longer serve as a possible pathway of contamination into the aquifer. So we have rules around that, and that applies to any Edwards Aquifer well being constructed. More specifically on the recharge zone, our board has passed rules that do require the registration of facilities that store large quantities of regulated substances on this recharge zone. And here we're talking about the large box stores, the Lowe's and Home Depots that might sell all these prepackaged herbicides and pesticides and dyes and other chemicals that we obviously wouldn't want to drink, or we wouldn't want them to puncture and leak into the aquifer. More significantly, though, the EAA does require the registration and proper approval of large above ground storage tanks and underground storage tanks that are located on the aquifer. And of course, these are located in businesses and industries that operate there, such as large stone quarries or cement plants, and of course, who have large above ground tanks. And then of course, the gas stations that are located on the recharge zone, those are highly regulated by us that require certain protective rules around the underground storage tanks themselves. So we do actively look at those.
So Ann-Margaret and Earl, I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I started my career at the EAA helping with the well team, helping folks register their wells and also looking at these abandoned wells. And you'd be surprised how many of them are still out there. Back in the day, municipal supplies weren't so readily available and a lot of folks had their own wells. Well, fast forward a few decades, they now have a municipal service, but they also have that old well in the backyard that's since become abandoned. And many of these are in old storage sheds that may be surrounded by fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides, and are frankly a huge threat to the aquifer. So the EAA is actively looking for these and helping folks get these plugged because they pose a huge threat to water quality.
It is one of our active areas, and we're continually looking for ways to better educate and assist well owners in plugging these old wells.
And that kind of has to do with the fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but these wells obviously probably haven't been used for years or maybe even decades. And then on top of it, that's kind of further explains why well maintenance is important, right? So it's like identifying if you even have a well on your property and then the condition that the well is in, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And, a lot of people figure, well, I'm not using the well anymore. I'm not using it to drink from. So, why do I need to keep it up? And, the big thing is, your well might be a source of contamination that might affect your neighbor's well. And as a community, it's very important for us to understand the impacts that we have on others. And, plugging your abandoned well is one of the biggest things that a landowner can do to protect the neighboring property in his community from potential contamination.
So now that we've kind of talked a little bit about how the EAA regulates the Edwards Aquifer and withdrawals from the aquifer and aquifer protection, how does the EAA approach rules compliance, and what happens if a violation occurs? How does the EAA work to amend these issues?
Yes. Well, for our regulated well owners, compliance issues usually revolve around the metering, reporting of use, and staying within those pumping limits. This yearly process starts at the end of each calendar year when the EAA meter team prepares and mails to all of our registered users an annual use reporting form. And our accounting department prepares the aquifer management fee invoices. So our staff, we collect all these forms and all these payments. And then, of course, we have to reach out using our contact information to solicit late reports and payments. Additionally, we identify the well owners who may have exceeded their authorized withdrawals. So for all these owners who failed to report their readings or failed to pay their fees or overpumped their authorization, these are what we call our common violations, and staff has an opportunity to settle these matters, usually by payment of a small fee or attendance at an EAA well owners workshop. We sponsor these things as an alternative. For permit holders who overpump their permit, they are offered a chance to seek out unpumped authorization from other permit holders, which we talked about earlier, or settle the amounts of the water they overpumped by basically paying water rights from our EAA Groundwater Trust. As I mentioned before, there are more available pumping rights than what is pumped in a year. So the challenge is sometimes to get the people who need with the people who have. As I mentioned, as a community of well owners, we don't overpump our total authorization, but individual well owners sometimes do. So our compliance staff, we work hard to reach these settlements outside of the EAA power to file civil lawsuits or assess administrative penalties, which are authorized under our act. We very seldom have to resort to filing civil lawsuits. And when we do, most of those are settled before even going to court. Historically, the EAA receives very little revenue from these compliance-related settlements. And any revenue we do receive is dedicated to the EAA Conservation and Aquifer Protection Fund. And none of this is used for general EAA operation. I did mention those water quality rules, so we do keep our eye on the facilities operating on the recharge zone, that store those large quantities of regulated materials. Our main job here is to make sure that these facilities are following their proper storage practices for their packaged containers. And for the tanks, the above ground and underground tanks, our main job is to make sure that these tanks are properly registered and are installed under an approved plan, either from the Texas Commission of Environmental Quality or the EAA. Violators here are required to remove those unapproved tanks from the recharge zone, or they may face a possible lawsuit and penalties.
So Earl, you've had a long and storied career here at the EAA. Can you talk to us about the strides that you've seen since you've been here at EAA in terms of the regulation and compliance?
Yeah, I think in my 17 plus years doing compliance and enforcement, I've seen a lot, and I've seen a lot of evolution. I think complying with the new rules and requirements from a new agency, when back in the day you'd pretty much been free to pump from your well, that was a big adjustment for everyone. I think it was an adjustment for us, this new agency, as to how do we enforce. And I think it was a big adjustment for our regulated community, as now having to follow these requirements. You know, early on, I think in the uncertainty of this new regulatory environment, and because our staff was so small, we as an agency were kind of more hands-off and more penalty-based to those who couldn't follow our rules. And these well owners were pretty much on their own to complete these requirements, and almost every violation involved some sort of monetary settlement. And then over time, based on a combination of community feedback in reaction to our enforcement, and working with our board of directors, and gaining more confidence and certainty in our own approaches, we've been able to provide a much better educational opportunity and develop more assistance programs more directly focused on assisting and achieving compliance and settling violations. I think some of the most significant of these outreach and service areas included grace periods for turning in these required documents so that EAA staff could identify and reach out after these deadlines and assist people with reporting and registration. You know, we've developed alternative settlements to paying money, such as attending educational workshops. And we also have more direct assistance to our regulated public. Now, as we talked about some of those old wells, in certain instances, we can provide geophysical logging services where we have tools that can assess the condition of these wells and determine if they're safe or how they can be repaired or if they need to be permanently plugged. We have metering assistance programs. I mentioned some of these new wells that we're finding. These folks need permits and they need meters. And we can assist them in getting a meter installed on their well, and they have a year to pay us back for those costs. We have critical period calculators on our website to help permit holders determine what their reductions might be so they can plan their water use. And we've developed a smartphone app and web-based platforms to make annual use reporting much easier. Back in the day, you would have to visit your well and your meter and take a pencil and paper and write down that meter reading and bring it back to your house and put it on a form and write it down on an annual use reporting form at the end of the year and mail it in. Well, now you can take your smartphone out to your well, open our app, jot down your meter reading, take a picture of the register and hit send, and you're done. It makes it so much nice. We've also now recently rolled out an online registration portal for those recharge zone facilities we regulate, which makes it so much easier for them to keep their registrations current and up to date. Finally, we've developed new settlement options for these permit holders who exceed their yearly amounts, who overpump, allowing them to lease groundwater from the EAA that we hold in trust from permit holders who don't want to pump that water and pay fees on it. They're able to put that water in the trust, and we can use that trust water to help overpumpers settle their problems. Most all of these services I mentioned were developed based on feedback from our regulated community and our efforts to directly assist people in achieving and maintaining compliance with our rules.
So, Earl, that's great. In recent years, our general manager, Roland Ruiz, has talked about this concept of regulation through service. And it seems like you've touched on many of these aspects. Basically, we want our stakeholders and community members and permit holders to be agents of conservation with us. And your initiatives that you talked about, these initiatives you talked about, are helping them to do that. So in the past, we may have been sort of heavy-handed with fees and penalties right off the bat, whereas now we seem to have lots of opportunities for them to gain education or gain outreach about our programs and why we have them.
Yes, and our board of directors has fully supported our efforts to reach out and assist our regulated public, and it's been really rewarding to be part of that.
So as Brent mentioned, we're doing more of regulation through service, and it seems that we've developed more customer service-based programs and initiatives and workshops to kind of bridge the gap and be there for the permit holders and the groundwater users. What do you see in the future for the EAA rules and in regards to rules compliance?
Well, as far as rules compliance, we believe here at the EAA that knowledge is power and good communication is key. We are continuing to find new and better ways to talk to those whom we regulate. And one big possibility is more automation and enhanced features on our EAA websites and our databases. We hope that one day a well owner will be able to see their individual authorization and how much they're using, to submit real-time meter readings, and perhaps even to lease additional water rights from the convenience of their iPhone or laptop. We're also looking to provide better graphic maps of our regulated areas to assist those new businesses developing around the recharge zone and providing them important registration and providing important registration information to first responders who have to deal with fires that might occur at these facilities on the recharge zone. Expanded education programs like this podcast are small examples of more and better information getting out to the public and those that we regulate. I think most important to my department is to continually find better ways to collaborate and communicate with our regulated public. We want to leverage the power of all these emerging technologies to effectively talk and communicate with those we regulate. With better education and understanding of the wonderful and unique nature of our shared Edwards Aquifer, we can all work together to better manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer system.
Hey, Earl, thank you so much for that. And it was a pleasure talking to you. I know I learned a lot, and thanks for coming on the podcast today.
I enjoy working with these folks and educating them. A lot of them just need to understand it is about our aquifer. It is something we all share and cherish. And those springs in New Braunfels and San Marcos are so beautiful. And our role is to help those springs flow so we can take our kids and grandkids and enjoy them forever. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to talk to y'all and everybody that we regulate.
Thanks, y'all, for tuning in to this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.